In the Cold War, there were places the Soviet Union believed were beyond reach, not beyond attack, beyond access. The Sea of Okhotsk was one of them. Cold, isolated, guarded by geography, weather, and military confidence, it was treated as a protected space, a maritime sanctuary for the Soviet Pacific Fleet. And somewhere beneath that dark water, on the floor of the sea almost no outsider could approach, a table carried some of the Soviet Navy's most sensitive communications: orders, movements, status reports, assumptions, the private rhythm of a nuclear power. Then, one day, American intelligence began to ask a dangerous question. What if that cable could be found? And what if it could be heard without the Soviets ever knowing? That question led to one of the boldest operations of the Cold War. Not in the skies, not in Berlin, not in some crowded embassy in Europe, but in total darkness, under the ocean. American submariners and divers would enter waters the Soviets believed were secure, descend to the seafloor, and attempt something that sounded almost absurd. They would try to listen to the Soviet Navy from the bottom of the sea. If they failed, there would be no public explanation, no rescue mission, no admission, only silence. Because this was not a military strike. It was something far more delicate, a hidden intrusion into the confidence of an empire. And for a time, it worked. What followed would become known as Operation Ivy Bells, a mission so secret, so improbable, that it sounded less like history and more like rumor. But the deepest part of the story is not that America found the cable. It is what America heard through it. And it is how that invisible victory, buried under cold block water, was eventually destroyed, not by Soviet sonar, not by a patrol ship, not by a submarine hunter, but by a man with deck, memory, and access to secrets he should never have been able to sell. By the late Cold War, the oceans had become more than borders or shipping lanes. They had become hiding places for nuclear power. Soviet ballistic missile submarines carried enough destructive force to change the balance of the world in a matter of minutes. And unlike missile silos or bomber bases, they could disappear. That made their home ports critically important. One of the most important was Petropavlovsk on the Kamchatka Peninsula. Remote, heavily defended, and deeply tied to Soviet naval operations in the Pacific, it was one of the places American intelligence watched most closely. Because if you wanted to understand the movement of Soviet submarines in the region, you had to understand the system around that base, how information moved, how commands moved, how fast decisions traveled from one point to another. The Soviets, of course, understood that too. That is why the Sea of Okhotsk was not treated like ordinary water. It was treated like a shield, a secure interior sea, a space protected not only by military presence, but by assumption. The assumption that no foreign submarine could operate there for long. The assumption that no one could reach the seabed close enough to matter. The assumption that communications carried beneath those waters were safe by default. And that assumption is what made the operation possible. Because in espionage, the most valuable secrets are often not the ones hidden behind the strongest locks. They are the ones hidden behind the strongest certainty. American planners began to suspect that Soviet naval commands in the Far East were linked by an undersea communications cable. The logic was simple. If the Soviets wanted secure communication between sensitive naval nodes, they would trust a hardline more than radio. Radio could be intercepted. Air traffic could be photographed. Surface ships could be tracked. But a cable on the ocean floor, in protected Soviet waters, would feel untouchable. and untouchable things tend to make people careless. Some later accounts connected this insight to Captain James Bradley, a Navy officer involved in undersea intelligence work. The story goes that the breakthrough came from something almost mundane. Along coastlines, utilities sometimes post warnings telling ships not to anchor in certain areas, not because the surface is dangerous, but because something important lies below it. A buried line, a cable, a hidden connection. If the Soviets had laid a communications cable in the region, there might be signs along the coast warning local traffic to stay clear. A tiny clue, a bureaucratic clue, the kind of clue most people ignore. But in intelligence work, entire operations can begin with details that look too ordinary to matter. Once that possibility took shape, the mission changed from theory to hunt. And the submarine chosen for the task was no ordinary submarine. USS Halibut had begun its life in a different role, but over time it had been transformed for work few people would ever know about. It became a platform for deep-sea search, photography, special equipment, and operations that sat somewhere between naval engineering and pure espionage. It was not just a submarine anymore. It was an instrument. Quiet machine designed to go where official history would not. And now it was heading toward one of the Soviet Union's most protected maritime spaces. Not to attack a fleet, not to shadow a ship, but to search for a single line on the bottom of the sea. A line that, if it existed, might reveal more than photographs ever could. Because pictures can show where weapons are. A table can tell you how people think. But finding it would be nearly impossible. The seafloor is vast, visibility is limited, pressure is unforgiving. And even if Halibut located the cable, that would only lead to a second problem, one even more dangerous than the first. Because touching a Soviet military communication line inside Soviet waters was one thing. Listening to it, without leaving a trace, was something else entirely. The search did not begin with a dramatic discovery. It began slowly, carefully, with coastline analysis, navigation, and the kind of patience that defines real intelligence work. Halibut moved into the region with extraordinary caution. Every mile mattered. Every sound mattered. This was not open ocean freedom. This was proximity to an adversary that would never tolerate what the Americans were attempting. If the submarine was detected in the wrong place, the mission could collapse instantly. And if the mission collapsed, Washington would have no clean explanation. There are operations governments can deny. This was the kind they would rather erase. Then the crews began to tighten. Warnings along the coast helped narrow the search. Patterns emerged. Possibilities became routes. And eventually, somewhere beneath the Sea of Okhotsk, Halibut found what it had come for. A cable, thick, heavy, lying on the seabed in the dark. Not a rumor, not an inference, a real Soviet communications line. At that moment, the operation crossed a threshold, because finding the cable proved the Americans had been right, but it did not prove they could survive the next step. The cable lay in deep water, far below the surface, in an environment where the ocean itself became part of the enemy. The divers who went down were not entering cinematic darkness. They were entering pressure, pull, isolation, depth that turned every movement into calculation. At that level, time is no longer casual. Breathing is no longer casual. Error is no longer recoverable. And yet they kept going. Out of the submarine, into black water, toward a Soviet military line no outsider was supposed to touch. The technical challenge was brutal. Crude tap would never work. They could not cut the cable. They could not open it. They could not leave visible damage or trigger an electrical fault that Soviet technicians might detect. The line had to keep functioning exactly as before. The Soviets had to continue trusting it. So the device designed for the mission had to do something extraordinary. It had to listen without wounding. According to later accounts, the solution was an induction tap, a device that clamped around the cable and drew signal from it without physically penetrating the line. That is what made the mission so elegant. The Americans were not stealing the cable. They were not interrupting it. They were sitting beside it, almost like a shadow, taking what passed through while the Soviet system above remained unaware. It was espionage at its most refined, not force, not theft in the obvious sense, presence without evidence. The installation itself demanded precision. Every movement on the sea floor had consequences. The divers had to work methodically, under pressure, in darkness, with a level of discipline that most people will never have to imagine. One mistake could destroy the device. One mistake could expose the mission. One mistake could leave men trapped in freezing water beneath a submarine that itself could not afford to be there. And the ocean was never passive. The sea above could change, currents could shift, equipment could fail, weather could turn a technical challenge into a survival problem. This was not a one-time dramatic gesture. It was controlled risk, sustained minute by minute. When the tap was finally in place, the mission still was not over, because the recordings had to be collected, retrieved, brought back, analyzed. The cable had been found, the device had been installed, but none of that mattered unless the Americans had actually captured something useful, something real, something the Soviets had never intended anyone outside their system to hear. So the submarine withdrew, the ocean closed over the operation, and somewhere inside that hidden system, tape and signal held the answer. The question now was simple. Had they just pulled one of the greatest intelligence coups of the Cold War, or had they risked everything for noise? What came back was not noise. It was voice. Real Soviet naval communications, carried through a line the Soviet Union believed was secure by geography alone. That was the first great shock of Ivy Bells. Not simply that the cable had been reached, but that it had been worth reaching. The line was alive, and what flowed through it was valuable. Not in the theatrical way people imagine espionage, not always code words, countdowns, or final decisions. Something more important than that. Pattern, routine, urgency, confidence. The inner tempo of command. That is what makes operations like this so powerful. A government can hide weapons. It can hide facilities. It can hide deployments for a while. But if you begin to hear how its officers speak when they believe no one is listening, you gain something deeper than a snapshot. You gain behavior. And behavior, over time, becomes prediction. Years later, accounts of the mission would describe the intelligence as immensely valuable. And that makes sense. The Soviets had trusted the cable because they trusted the location. They trusted the sea. They trusted the depth. They trusted the logic that no American submarine would ever be able to reach the line, place a device on it, return to recover the recordings, and leave without being detected. That level of confidence shaped how secure they felt while using it. And security, once assumed, has a way of relaxing people. That was the real American advantage, not merely access to a cable, access to a mindset. From that point on, the mission became more than a daring success. It became a sustained intelligence asset. Submarines would return, recordings would be collected, equipment would be maintained or improved. The operation moved from impossible experiment to hidden capability. And the symbolism of that matters. Because Ivy Bells was not a victory of size, it was a victory of precision. The Soviet Union had built a protected zone. The United States studied it. The Soviet Union had trusted depth. The United States learned to work at depth. The Soviet Union had trusted a cable. The United States found a way to hear it without breaking it. That is the kind of Cold War success that rarely appeared in speeches. It was too secret, too technical, too quiet. But it reflected something essential about the rivalry. The contest was not always won by whoever shouted louder. Sometimes, it was won by whoever could go farther into the dark and keep their presence invisible. For American analysts, the haul was not just about isolated messages. It was about context, how quickly commands moved, when activity intensified, what type of naval rhythm preceded movement, how Soviet commanders responded to events in the Pacific. Even routine chatter could become meaningful when placed in sequence, because intelligence is often less about one dramatic sentence and more about repeated signals that reveal a system from the inside. And for a time, the Soviets seemed to have asked the wrong question. They watched the skies. They watched the surface. They watched for intruders in the obvious places. But the most dangerous intrusion was already below them. Silent, patient, attached to a line they still trusted. That is what gave the operation its eerie quality. The Americans were not just listening to the Soviet Navy. They were listening from within a Soviet assumption, from inside a space the Soviets believed belonged only to them. And yet, for all its brilliance, Ivy Bells had a weakness. Not in the table, not in the device, not in the submarine. A deeper weakness, the kind every secret operation carries from the moment it is born. Because no matter how well a mission is hidden in the sea, it still has to be known by someone on land. And sooner or later, one of those people can become the brooch. The end of Ivy Bells did not begin in the ocean. It began in a life that had come apart. Ronald Pelton had once worked inside the American signals intelligence world. He had access to sensitive knowledge. He understood Soviet targets. He understood collection systems. And after leaving government service, he faced the kind of personal collapse that intelligence agencies have always feared. Financial pressure, instability, desperation. In 1980, Pelton contacted the Soviet embassy in Washington. That single act would become one of the most damaging turns in the story. Because Pelton did not need to steal stacks of documents to be dangerous. He carried something else. Memory. He knew enough to tell the Soviets what mattered. Enough to point toward operations they had never fully suspected. Enough to turn invisible advantage into vulnerability. That is what makes espionage history so unsettling. A government can spend years solving impossible technical problems. It can build devices, redesign submarines, train divers, manage secrecy, protect compartments, and bury an operation under layers of classification. And then, one compromised insider can open the door from the inside. Pelton sold information for money. Not legendary money. Not the kind of fortune people imagine in spy fiction. Just enough to prove a darker truth. Some of the costliest secrets in history have been lost cheaply. For years, the exact shape of the compromise remained hidden from the public. But the strategic reality is hard to escape. Once the Soviets knew where to look, or even what kind of operation to suspect, the invisibility of Ivy Bells was damaged. A hidden tap remains hidden only as long as the target has no reason to examine the line, no reason to imagine the method, no reason to distrust the certainty that once protected it. Pelton gave them reason. And when a secret operation loses surprise, it begins to die. The operation had survived death, cold, pressure, distance, and Soviet confidence. What it could not fully survive was betrayal. Years later, another piece of the story emerged through the defection of KGB officer Vitaly Yurchenko. He provided clues that helped American investigators narrow in on the source of a damaging leak. The name was not immediate. The path was not simple, but eventually Pelton was identified, watched, confronted, and broken. He confessed. He was arrested. And with that, one of the most extraordinary undersea espionage operations of the Cold War stood exposed. Not publicly at first, not in the full dramatic sense, but exposed where it mattered most, inside the intelligence war itself. That ending changes the emotional shape of the story, because Ivy Bells is not just a tale of ingenuity, it is a tale of fragility. America solved the ocean. America solved the cable. America solved the problem of lifting without leaving visible damage. America solved the technical incrossability, but it could not eliminate the oldest danger in intelligence work, the human being, the insider under pressure, the person who knows just enough. That is why the story does not end like a clean triumph. It ends with a shadow over the victory, a reminder that even the most brilliant operation is never fully protected from weakness within. And maybe that is what gives Ivy Bells its lasting power. It was not loud, it was not public, it did not become a national myth in real time. Most people never heard of it while it mattered, and yet it captures something essential about the Cold War. That some of the most important battles were fought in silence, not for territory, for awareness, not for spectacle, for advantage, not to destroy the enemy outright, but to know him better than he knew himself. Still, the story leaves something unfinished, because once you accept that America could descend into protected Soviet waters and hear a military table from the ocean floor, another question begins to rise. What else was down there? What else had been found in the dark long before the public ever learned its name? Ivy Bells was not an isolated miracle. It was part of a deeper pattern, older pattern, a version of the Cold War that unfolded beneath the surface, far from cameras and speeches. Because the ocean kept more than cables, it kept wrecks, weapons, missing submarines. And some of those secrets drew American attention in ways just as audacious, and perhaps even stranger. Years before Ivy Bells entered the shadows of history, a Soviet submarine called K-129 vanished in the Pacific. It disappeared beneath the surface with missiles, codes, and unanswered questions inside it. The Soviets searched for it and failed. The Americans did not. At some point, somewhere in the silent geography of the ocean floor, the United States found what the Soviet Union could not recover, and instead of merely observing it, American intelligence would eventually attempt something even more extraordinary, to raise part of it from the deep. That story belongs to another threshold, another descent, another operation shaped by secrecy, engineering, and the belief that the most important truths of the Cold War were often buried where no one expected the public to ever look. Maybe that is the real legacy of Ivy Bells, not just that America listened, but that it proved how far beneath the surface this rivalry had already gone. Officially, wars are remembered through battles, speeches, summits, and treaties, but some of the most decisive advantages are never announced. They are hidden in cables, stored on reels, carried back through dark water, and protected by silence until silence breaks. Because perhaps the deepest victories of the Cold War were not the ones the world celebrated. Perhaps they were the ones no one was supposed to hear. And perhaps once you begin following those hidden signals, one story is never enough, because the ocean does not give up one secret at a time. It keeps layers, and below the cable, there was still a wreck.